I didn't notice it at first because nothing dramatic ever happened. No sounds in the walls. No objects moving when my back was turned. No cold drafts slipping across the floor. No flickering lights. No shadows behaving incorrectly. If anything, my apartment felt more stable than other places. Not warmer. Not safer. Just structurally reliable. The kind of quiet that isn't simply the absence of noise, but the absence of unpredictability. The building is new. Concrete construction. Thick walls. Good insulation. Outside sounds arrive already softened, already processed into something distant and non-urgent. Traffic becomes a low, continuous texture, rather than individual cars. Voices from the street dissolve into vowel-shaped murmurs. Even sirens pass like weather instead of events. Inside, everything sits where it should. Clean lines. Right angles. Neutral colors. Furniture chosen for function more than personality. Nothing here leans. Nothing here wobbles. Nothing hums louder than expected or shuts off at irregular intervals. It is the architectural equivalent of a steady pulse. I work remotely, which means I spend more time inside this space than most people spend in their homes. My routines formed slowly, without intention, until they felt inevitable. Coffee in the same spot by the window. Laptop open before the caffeine fully registers. Emails first. Then work that requires actual thinking. Lunch whenever hunger becomes noticeable enough to interrupt focus. Evenings that don't so much begin as gradually replace the day. Sometimes I realize it's dark outside only because the window has turned into a mirror. Nothing about my life here feels unusual. Not exciting, not bleak. Just consistent. A quiet middle ground, where days pass without friction. Which is probably why the first incident didn't register as anything meaningful. I was in the kitchen rinsing a glass. Just a glass. Nothing fragile, nothing special. Running water. Ordinary pressure. Ordinary temperature. I remember turning the faucet off, setting the glass upside down on the rack, and wiping my hands on a towel. Then I turned toward the living room, and for a fraction of a second, maybe less, the room stopped feeling dimensional. Not flat. Not warped. Not spinning. Settled. That's the closest word I have for it. The distance between me and the refrigerator felt shorter, but not because I had moved. The hum of the appliance blended seamlessly with the faint noise from outside, until I couldn't tell which sound belonged closer to me. The air felt smoother, as if breathing required slightly less effort. Not deeper, not faster. Just less opposed. Nothing dramatic changed. The light didn't dim. The walls didn't shift. There was no sensation of motion. Just a quiet, clinical awareness that the space had reached a configuration where nothing needed adjusting. Then it passed. No dizziness. No nausea. No disorientation. No aftershock. If I hadn't been paying attention, and I usually don't, I might not have noticed at all. I shrugged it off almost immediately. People stand up too fast. Blood pressure dips. Eyes refocus. Brains misfire. Bodies are messy systems pretending to be precise. By dinner, I had already forgotten. Until it happened again. This time, it was late afternoon. I was walking from the bedroom down the hallway, not thinking about anything in particular, when the space seemed to compress. Again. Not visibly. Not measurably. Perceptually. The hallway didn't look shorter, but the idea of distance lost its sharpness. The far wall didn't feel far. The doorway behind me didn't feel behind. Everything existed at the same neutral remove, as though depth had become optional. I stopped walking, not out of fear, more like curiosity mixed with the instinct to confirm whether I had imagined it. The walls were where they should be. The ceiling hadn't lowered. The light hadn't changed color. But the space felt finished. That's the strange part. Not wrong. Not distorted. Finished. Like a puzzle with no missing pieces and no extra ones forced into place. Then depth returned, quietly, without transition. The way a background noise becomes noticeable only after it stops. I kept walking. That time I didn't forget. Not immediately. The experience lingered just long enough to invite explanation. Fatigue made sense. I had slept poorly the night before. Dehydration was possible. I hadn't had water since morning. I strained from staring at screens all day. Extremely plausible. I drank water. I blinked more deliberately. I made a mental note to go to bed earlier. The human brain is very good at filing unusual experiences into folders labeled solved, even when nothing has actually been solved. For a few days, nothing happened. Then the third time. That was the one that changed the category from physiological oddity to something else. It happened exactly as I stepped through the front door. Not when I turned the key. Not while I stood outside. Not after I had already entered. At the threshold. 1 foot inside. 1 foot still out. For a fraction of a second, the apartment felt complete. Not cozy. Not welcoming. Not safe. Complete. Like a finished equation. Balanced on both sides. Nothing missing. Nothing excessive. Nothing resolved waiting to be accounted for later. I froze with my hand still on the doorknob. The sensation did not escalate. It did not fade immediately either. It simply existed, perfectly neutral, perfectly stable, as though the space had reached a state that required no further adjustment. Then it released. Depth returned. Sound separated into foreground and background. The faint pressure of air against skin and lungs reasserted itself. I stepped fully inside. Nothing else happened. No follow-up. No delayed effect. No emotional response beyond mild confusion. But that moment stayed with me. Because it didn't feel like something had occurred. It felt like something had briefly reached completion. After that, I began to notice patterns. Never outside. Never in cafes. Never at friends' homes. Never in elevators or stairwells or grocery stores. Only here. Only inside my apartment. And not every time. Which would have been easier to categorize as a medical symptom or environmental trigger. Just often enough to feel deliberate, but not enough to predict. I started experimenting without formally deciding to. Entering slowly. Pausing halfway through the doorway. Leaning in. Then stepping back out. Nothing. The sensation did not respond to movement. It did not care how I entered, how fast, or whether I hesitated. It only happened when I was inside. Not arriving. Not crossing. Not touching the door. Inside. That distinction bothered me more than the sensation itself. Because it implied the trigger wasn't an action. It was a condition. One night I came home later than usual, sometime after midnight. The building had switched to its overnight lighting, dimmer, slightly yellow, flattening the hallway into a long, quiet corridor that felt less like a place people lived, and more like a space temporarily holding objects called apartments. My door looked exactly as it always did. Matte paint. Small metal number plate. No scratches. No dents. No sign that anything unusual had ever occurred on the other side of it. I unlocked it. Opened it. Stepped across. And the sensation hit harder than before. Not painful. Not overwhelming. Just clearer. The living room appeared sharper, without becoming brighter. Edges of furniture looked more exact, as if someone had adjusted an invisible focus knob that controlled geometry instead of vision. Sound collapsed inward. The distant traffic, the ventilation system, the faint rustle of my jacket. Everything felt equally close to me, not louder, not quieter, equally present. Depth didn't vanish. It stopped mattering. I stood there, halfway between inside and outside, holding my keys, suddenly aware of my own breathing in a way that felt observational rather than embodied. I didn't feel watched. I didn't feel threatened. I felt accounted for, as if the room had been waiting to include me in something already in progress, not welcoming me, not reacting to me, simply incorporating me. Then it stopped. The couch returned to being just a couch. The far wall retreated to a comfortable distance. City noise reassumed its proper position as background. Only a thin residue remained, not emotional, not physical, just a precise certainty that something structural had occurred. I closed the door slowly, locked it, stood there longer than necessary, listening to the normal sounds of my apartment reassert themselves. Refrigerator hum, faint airflow, the quiet mechanical life of a modern building continuing without reference to me. And that was when the experience shifted from odd to unsettling. Not because it intensified, because I understood something about it. It didn't happen because I came home. It happened because I was home. I tested that idea over the following days. If I left for only a few minutes and returned, sometimes it happened again. Sometimes it didn't. If I stayed out 4 hours, the probability seemed higher, though not reliably so. Time away didn't cause it. Entry didn't cause it. Presence did. That realization created a new kind of awareness, not fear, not anticipation. Just a quiet monitoring of my own state relative to the space. Was I inside? Fully inside? Had I been inside long enough to count? These questions never felt dramatic. More like checking whether a device had connected to a network. Most of the time, nothing happened, but occasionally, without warning, the apartment would settle around me again. While I was making coffee, while I was brushing my teeth, while I was sitting perfectly still doing nothing at all. Always brief, always neutral, always precise, and always only here. Eventually I tried the most obvious test. I left the apartment for several days. A work trip, hotel room, unfamiliar layout, different sounds, different bed. I paid close attention, half expecting the sensation to follow me, half hoping it would. Nothing happened, not once. The hotel room behaved like a normal room, imperfect, slightly noisy, faintly unpredictable in all the ways that make spaces feel alive. When I returned home and unlocked my door, I already knew what to watch for. I stepped inside, and the apartment clicked into that completed state before I had even taken off my shoes. Stronger than before, cleaner, more exact. As if absence had not paused, whatever process governed it. As if my return simply allowed it to register me again. That was the moment unease replaced curiosity, because it suggested something I could not comfortably explain away. It didn't occur randomly. It didn't depend on my attention. It didn't require my actions. It only required that I be here. Not visiting, not arriving, home. And once that idea took hold, another question followed naturally, one that I still haven't answered. If it only happens when I'm home, what, exactly, is happening the rest of the time? After I realized it only happened when I was home, I expected the feeling to intensify. That's what patterns usually do. Once identified, they either weaken under scrutiny or grow stronger, more defined, more insistent. Noise becomes signal. Coincidence becomes mechanism. This did neither. It remained indifferent. Days passed where nothing occurred at all. I would move through the apartment normally, working, cooking, showering, pacing during phone calls, and the space behaved exactly like a space. 3 dimensions, predictable acoustics, air with the usual faint resistance that makes breathing feel embodied rather than theoretical. Then, without warning, it would happen again. No build-up, no presignal, no gradual approach, just that instantaneous settling, as if the room had been adjusted to a final configuration, and I had stepped into it mid-process. I began keeping track, though not formally. No notebook, no spreadsheet, no obsessive logging, just a quiet mental tally. Morning, rarely. Afternoon, occasionally. Evening, more often. Late nights, most consistently. But still not reliably. There was no exact time, no repeating minute, no cycle tied to sunlight or darkness or routine. The only constant was location. Home. At first, I wondered if it had something to do with the building itself. New construction can be strange, materials settling, work systems cycling, electrical loads fluctuating as other apartments draw power. Entire structures subtly breathe, expand, contract, hum in ways that are usually below the threshold of awareness. But none of that explained the quality of the sensation. Buildings creak, pipes vibrate, floors flex imperceptibly under weight. Those are physical events with directional cues. Something you can point to afterward and say, it came from there. This had no direction. It didn't derive from the walls or the floor or the ceiling. It didn't pass through the space like a wave. It simply replaced the normal configuration of the room with one that felt resolved. Not improved. Not degraded. Resolved. I tested the building hypothesis the obvious way, by leaving my apartment but staying inside the structure. Hallways, laundry room, lobby, stairwells, nothing. The building outside my door felt ordinary, slightly echoing, faintly impersonal, carrying the distant signatures of other people's lives without revealing anything specific. Footsteps above. A television somewhere behind a wall. The metallic click of an elevator stopping on another floor. Messy, layered, human noise. My apartment alone behaved differently. That distinction was subtle but unmistakable, like stepping from a crowded street into a soundproof booth. Not silent, just internally coherent. I started lingering in the hallway outside my door before entering, trying to catch the transition in real time. The hallway felt like a corridor. The door felt like a door. The key turned with ordinary mechanical resistance. Then I would step inside. Sometimes nothing happened. Other times the shift occurred immediately, like crossing an invisible boundary that had nothing to do with the threshold itself. The unsettling part was not the sensation. It was the neutrality of it. No emotion accompanied it. No instinct to flee, investigate, or brace for something else. My body did not interpret it as danger. My mind did not scramble to explain it in urgent terms. If anything, it produced the opposite of panic. Stillness. Not imposed stillness. Not paralysis, just the absence of any reason to move. One night, after a particularly long stretch without incidents, I began to wonder if it had stopped entirely. The apartment had felt normal for almost a week. Long enough for the memory of the sensation to blur at the edges. I was sitting on the couch, laptop closed, not doing anything productive. The television was on, but muted, throwing soft light across the room in shifting rectangles. Outside, traffic was light, occasional cars, long quiet intervals between them. I remember thinking that the apartment felt unusually peaceful, not empty, not lonely. Just settled in the ordinary sense. The way spaces feel late at night when nothing is expected to happen. Then the entire room tightened. Not visually, not physically, structurally. The light from the television stopped looking like illumination and started looking like placement, as if each bright shape on the wall had been arranged according to a precise plan, rather than random motion. The sound of a passing car no longer traveled from one side of the room to the other. It simply existed, fully formed, with no sense of movement. I became aware of my own posture. Back straight, shoulders lowered, breathing shallow but unstrained. Not because I had adjusted myself, because that position felt correct. The thought arrived quietly. This is the state the room prefers. Not wants, not demands. Prefers in the same way a system has an optimal configuration where friction is minimized and stability maximized. I sat there, hands resting on my knees, feeling less like an occupant and more like a component. Then, just as quietly, the room released. Sound regained direction. The television returned to being background noise. My shoulders lifted slightly without conscious effort, as if gravity had recalibrated. I leaned back, suddenly aware of how long I had been sitting perfectly still. The timestamp on the television guide indicated only about 40 seconds had passed. 40 seconds felt too precise to be accidental and too brief to be meaningful, unless duration wasn't the point. After that night, a new possibility began to form. Not a belief, not even a hypothesis, just a shape of an idea. What if it wasn't something happening to the apartment? What if it was something happening through it? The distinction mattered because it removed the need for a cause tied to physical conditions, temperature, wiring, materials, structural stress. All of those belonged to the category of things acting on the space. This felt more like the space briefly aligning with something external to itself. I didn't pursue that idea too far. Speculation without evidence tends to spiral into narratives that feel convincing, but explain nothing. Instead, I tried altering the apartment itself. Furniture rearrangement first. I moved the couch to a different wall, rotated the rug, shifted the coffee table several feet to the left. The room looked unfamiliar afterward, not dramatically different, but enough to disrupt muscle memory. If the sensation depended on geometry, this should have changed something. It didn't. The next time it occurred, the new layout felt just as complete as the old one had, which meant completeness wasn't tied to arrangement. I tried lighting. All lamps on, all lamps off, overhead lights only, shades drawn, shades open. Daylight versus darkness made no difference. I tried sound. Music playing loudly, white noise, complete silence, television chatter. During the alignment, all sound flattened into the same neutral presence regardless of its source. I tried movement, walking, standing still, lying down, me gesture. Once, it happened, while I was reaching for a book on the shelf. My arm remained extended, fingers hovering just short of the spine. Not because I chose to pause, but because finishing the motion felt unnecessary. As though the action belonged to a version of the room that no longer existed. That was the first time the experience left a residue afterward. Not physical, not emotional, procedural. I found myself hesitating before resuming movement, unsure whether the prior intention still applied. It felt like continuing a sentence after someone had quietly replaced the conversation. Another question emerged then, one I had avoided. Was it interacting with me? Up to that point, I had treated myself as incidental, a witness, at most a censor. The phenomenon happened regardless of what I did, when I did it, or whether I paid attention. But the posture correction, the halted movement, the sense of being positioned rather than position myself, those implied participation, not voluntary participation, inclusion. I tested that idea by leaving the apartment immediately after one of the episodes. No preparation, no waiting. I grabbed my keys and walked out, down the hallway, into the stairwell, out onto the street. The city felt chaotic by comparison. Not noisy, just layered. Sounds overlapping at different distances, lights reflecting off uneven surfaces. People moving unpredictably, air carrying traces of heat, cold, exhaust, food, moisture. Messy, alive, unresolved. I walked for nearly an hour, expecting some kind of residual sensation to follow me. Nothing did. By the time I returned, the outside world had already overwritten the memory of the alignment with ordinary sensory clutter. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and the apartment settled immediately. Not gradually, not after a pause, instantly, as if my absence had been a temporary removal of a piece from a completed structure. I closed the door behind me, suddenly aware that the hallway outside felt less real than the room I had just re-entered. That thought disturbed me more than anything else so far, because it suggested a hierarchy. Outside, variable, unfinished, contingent. Inside, stable, resolved, primary. I didn't like that implication. Homes are supposed to be refuges, not reference points. That night I slept poorly, not from fear but from a persistent cognitive friction. The mind's equivalent of a background process consuming resources without producing visible results. In the morning, the apartment looked ordinary again. Sunlight across the floor, dust motes drifting lazily in the air. The quiet domestic hum of appliances beginning another day. Nothing about it suggested hidden precision or structural preference. If anything, it looked slightly imperfect. A chair not fully pushed in, a mug left on the counter, a throw blanket folded unevenly. Human traces, reassuring, in their way. For most of the day, I almost convinced myself the entire experience had been exaggerated by fatigue and isolation. People who spend too much time alone sometimes develop heightened sensitivity to environmental subtleties. That explanation held until early evening. I was standing by the window, looking out at the city without really seeing it, when the reflection of the room behind me snapped into perfect symmetry. Not mirrored. It had always been mirrored. Balanced. Every object seemed placed at exactly the right distance from every other object. Angles aligning in a way that felt less like design and more like inevitability. I turned around. The room itself had entered that completed state again, and in that moment, a realization surfaced that I had not allowed myself to articulate before. It doesn't only happen when I'm home. It happens because I live here. The apartment wasn't just a location where the phenomenon occurred. It was the location where I belonged. Not emotionally, not socially, structurally. As if, in some quiet way, I could not perceive directly. The space had calibrated itself around my continued presence, not reacting to me, not adapting, but incorporating me into whatever configuration it briefly achieved. The unsettling question that followed was unavoidable. If the apartment had aligned around me, what would happen if I stopped living here? And beneath that, a quieter, more disturbing one. Had it always been aligning? Long before I noticed. And I had simply been too imprecise to feel it. I stood there long after the sensation released, watching the room return to ordinary symmetry. Objects drifting back into the comfortable imperfection of everyday life. Nothing looked wrong. Nothing felt hostile. Nothing suggested urgency. But for the first time, the apartment no longer felt like a place I occupied. It felt like a system I was embedded in. And systems, once established, tend not to depend on whether the components understand them. They only depend on whether the components remain in place. After I began to suspect that the apartment wasn't just where it happened, but why, I stopped thinking in terms of events. Events imply beginnings and endings. This had neither. What I had been calling episodes no longer felt discrete. They felt like brief moments when an underlying condition became visible. The way a pattern in fabric only reveals itself when the light hits it at a particular angle. The alignment wasn't arriving. It was surfacing. That distinction changed how I experienced the apartment even when nothing unusual was occurring. Ordinary space no longer felt fully neutral. It felt like a looser configuration of something that could, at any moment, resolve into a more exact version of itself. Not a better version, a stricter one. I began noticing tiny inconsistencies that had never registered before. The way the kitchen counter didn't quite run parallel to the far wall. The slight tilt of a bookshelf. The uneven spacing between picture frames I had hung years ago without measuring carefully. None of it had mattered. Now it felt provisional, like objects placed temporarily until a final arrangement could be determined. I told myself this was just heightened awareness. The brain searching for patterns because it had been primed to expect them. Once you notice asymmetry, you start seeing it everywhere. That's normal. But the discomfort didn't come from imperfection. It came from the sense that the apartment tolerated imperfection only between alignments, as though precision were the default state, and disorder the interruption. One night, I decided to stop moving things back after they drifted out of place. Normally I kept the apartment tidy, not obsessively, just enough to maintain a sense of control. Dishes washed, surfaces cleared, objects returned to their usual locations. That night I left everything where it fell. A glass on the coffee table at an angle. A chair slightly pulled away from the desk. A jacket draped unevenly over the back of it. Books stacked off-center. Nothing chaotic. Just uncorrected. I wanted to see what would happen when the alignment arrived in a space that was visibly unresolved. For most of the evening, nothing did. The apartment looked like any mildly untidy home. Lived in, human. Unconcerned with geometric perfection. The television murmured quietly. Traffic ebbed and flowed outside. Air moved through the vents with its usual faint mechanical rhythm. I almost forgot what I was waiting for. Then the shift occurred. It didn't smooth the mess away. It didn't rearrange anything physically. But the disorder stopped reading as disorder. The glass on the table no longer looked crooked. It looked intentionally placed at that exact angle. The draped jacket became a precise shape rather than a careless one. The uneven stack of books appeared balanced, not by symmetry, but by some internal logic I could not articulate. Nothing moved. Interpretation changed. The room had not corrected the objects. It had corrected the frame in which the objects existed. I felt the now familiar settling in my body, shoulders lowering, breath thinning, posture aligning without conscious input. But this time there was an additional sensation, faint but unmistakable. Relief. Not emotional relief. Structural relief. Like tension being removed from a system that had been compensating for imprecision. The thought came uninvited. This is how it's supposed to be. Not aesthetically. Fundamentally. For the first time, I wondered whether the ordinary state of the apartment, the one I considered normal, was actually the distorted one. The alignment ended, as it always did. Gently, without drama. Depth returned. Sound separated into layers again. The room resumed its loose, human arrangement. But something had shifted inside me. I no longer felt like the alignment imposed itself on the space. It revealed it. After that, the intervals between occurrences seemed shorter, though I couldn't prove it. Without a fixed schedule, memory becomes unreliable. Events blur together, and the brain retroactively constructs patterns that may not exist. Still, the apartment felt increasingly anticipatory, not tense, ready, even when I was working, distracted, or half asleep on the couch. Part of my awareness remained tinged to the possibility of that settling. Not waiting for it, not bracing, just aware that the underlying structure could surface at any moment. Eventually, I stopped leaving the apartment unless necessary, not out of fear of the outside world, because the outside felt less definitive. On the street, everything seemed contingent: weather, traffic, people's movements, the unpredictable choreography of public space. Nothing held still long enough to feel resolved. Inside, even in its ordinary state, the apartment now carried a faint echo of precision, as if it remembered what it could be. I began spending long stretches sitting quietly, not meditating, not thinking deeply, just present, allowing the space to exist around me without imposing activity onto it. The alignment still came without warning, but when it did, I started noticing something new. The duration was increasing, not dramatically, not from seconds to minutes, just enough to register. 30 seconds became 40. 40 became nearly a minute, long enough that the absence of urgency itself became noticeable. During one of these extended alignments, I became aware of the clock on the wall. Its second hand moved, but the movement didn't feel like time passing. It felt like a mechanism operating inside a system that was otherwise unconcerned with duration. The room did not anticipate the next second. It simply existed in a completed state while the clock performed its function. That was when the most unsettling realization so far emerged. The alignment was not synchronized with time. Time was continuing independently of it. I don't mean time stopped. The clock proved it hadn't. My breathing continued. My pulse was steady. External sounds still occurred. A car passing, a distant siren, the faint thud of a door somewhere else in the building. But none of those things influenced the state of the room. Normally, environments respond to time. Light shifts, shadows move, sounds accumulate, energy dissipates. The world evolves moment by moment. During the alignment, the apartment did not evolve. It held. Not frozen, stable, like a solved equation. After that night, I began to understand why leaving felt increasingly pointless. Outside, everything remained subject to change. Inside, I had glimpsed a state where change was not required, not prevented, unnecessary. Sleep became irregular, though not absent. I would rest when fatigue demanded it, wake without alarm, move through the apartment in slow, deliberate routines that required minimal decision-making. Days blurred. Nights lost their distinct character. Light and darkness felt like surface conditions rather than meaningful transitions. The apartment remained a constant. One evening, though I can't be certain, it was evening, the concept was already losing clarity. I stood in the center of the living room without any particular reason. Not waiting. Just there. The alignment began almost imperceptibly, like a lens coming into focus. Air thinned first, breath moving without resistance, sound compressed into a single, uniform presence, light flattened, shadows dissolving into soft gradients without sharp edges. Then something different happened. The settling did not stop at the room. It included me. Not physically, my body did not move, but the sense of being separate from the space diminished. Normally you feel your boundaries, skin against air, weight against the floor, the subtle effort required to maintain posture. That effort vanished. I was not supported. I was not suspended. I was simply part of the configuration. No anxiety accompanied this. No instinct to pull away. If anything, the absence of internal friction felt profoundly natural, like finally standing correctly after years of compensating for a posture you didn't know was wrong. A thought surfaced, calm and precise. Nothing here is extra. Not the furniture, not the light, not the air, not me. For a moment, or whatever the equivalent of a moment was in that state, I considered moving, not to escape, to test whether motion was still meaningful. My foot lifted slightly from the floor. There was no resistance, no imbalance, no sense of shifting weight. The movement did not disturb the room's stability, it simply became part of it, like adjusting a variable that had already been accounted for. I set my foot back down. Again, no disruption, which meant the alignment did not require stillness. It incorporated change without losing precision. That realization was both reassuring and deeply unsettling, because it implied that nothing I did could take me outside it once it had fully engaged. Then, gradually, almost kindly, the room released. Depth returned, air regained texture, sound separated into layers again. My body felt heavy, localized, bounded. I exhaled without realizing I had been holding my breath, though in retrospect, I wasn't sure I had been breathing in the usual sense at all. Afterward, I expected some emotional reaction, fear, relief, confusion. None arrived. What I felt instead was a quiet certainty, not about what it was, about what it wasn't. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't trying to communicate. It wasn't building toward an outcome. If anything, it seemed indifferent to whether I understood it at all. The apartment looked ordinary again, slightly imperfect, gently asymmetrical, full of the small irregularities that make spaces feel human. But the ordinariness now read as temporary, like a sketch laid over a finished drawing. I walked to the window and looked out at the city. Lights flickered in other apartments. Cars moved through intersections. People passed along the sidewalks, each carrying their own trajectories, unaware of the precise stillness that had just occupied this one room. For the first time, I wondered whether similar alignments were happening elsewhere, not in other homes, not to other people, but as part of a larger structure that occasionally became locally visible. Not events, conditions. The unsettling possibility was not that my apartment was unique, it was that it wasn't. That night, as I lay in bed, not trying to sleep, not trying to stay awake, I realized something else. The question that had driven everything so far had been wrong. I had been asking why it only happened when I was home. The better question was, why did I end up in the place where it happens? No answer followed. None was needed, because the apartment did not feel like a location anymore. It felt like a coordinate, not a point in space, a point in whatever underlying structure briefly revealed itself. During those moments of perfect alignment, I closed my eyes, not to sleep, just to reduce variables. Behind my eyelids, the darkness felt the same as the room had during alignment, uniform, depthless, complete. For a brief instant, I could not tell whether my eyes were open or closed. Then ordinary perception returned, and with it the familiar sense of being inside a body, inside a room, inside a life defined by boundaries and durations. Nothing dramatic happened, no final shift, no resolution. Morning would come, as it always did. The apartment would look normal, coffee would taste like coffee, messages would need answering, the outside world would continue its layered, imprecise motion, and sooner or later, without warning, the space would resolve again. Not because I summoned it, not because it required me, but because, for reasons I could neither confirm nor disprove. This was where the structure of things briefly chose to become exact. It only happens when I'm home. At least, that's the only place I've learned to notice it. Whether that means I live in the right place, or simply that I've stopped living anywhere else, is a distinction I'm no longer certain matters. The apartment is quiet now, ordinary, unresolved, but not empty, just waiting, not for something to begin, not for something to end, but for the moment when the world, for a few precise seconds, remembers the shape it holds when nothing is misaligned. And when it does, I will be here, not observing, not participating, simply present in the one place where presence appears to fit.